Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thanks to all of you for joining us for Gratz College's Stern Family Lecture on Israel Studies. We are proud to present Dr. Abraham Wagner, who will be presenting Israel and the Possibilities for Peace. There will be an opportunity to post questions to Dr. Wagner later in the program, so if you have any questions for him, please enter them using the Q&A tool on your Zoom toolbar. You can also use this tool if you have a question for our IT support team. And just know that only the host and moderators will see your questions. The program will be recorded, and we will share this with all of the folks who registered once we've posted it on our YouTube channel. So please join me now in welcoming the president of Gratz College, Dr. Paul Finkelman.
Slow technology tonight, I'm sorry. Welcome to Gratz College. Thank you all for coming. And I especially, of course, want to thank the Stern family, Jerry Stern and his wife, Marilyn, for their continuing engagement with Gratz. The Stern Lecture is the realization of the vision of the late Harry Stern and his generous endowment established more than 30 years ago for lectures on Israel and Zionism, have made these annual lectures possible. I'm delighted that we're doing one tonight, and I'm particularly delighted that we are having a lecture by Abraham Wagner. Abe Wagner has been teaching in areas of national security and intelligence at a variety of institutions, including Columbia University's International Public Affairs School, Columbia Law School, and at NYU and also at UCLA Law School. He regularly lectures on national security and counterterrorism. He writes and consults on national security, generally with a focus on the Middle East. He is a senior fellow at the Center for Advanced Studies on Terrorism and serves as a consultant to several U.S. government agencies. He has served in a number of administrations, both Democratic and Republican, over the years, and he has served in a number of positions within the United States government, including on the National Security Council staff, the Office of the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and the Department of Defense. Abe holds both a PhD and a JD, as well as a bachelor's degree. He is a native of Buffalo, New York, and he is the author of a number of books, including most recently a biography of Henry Kissinger called Henry Kissinger, Pragmatic Statement in Hostile Times, that appeared in 2019, and a new book called Cybersecurity and Cyber Law, which was published by Carolina Academic Press this year and is now being picked up by a number of law schools to teach cybersecurity law. He has published many book chapters, op-eds in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Times, and various other newspapers. The last time I was in Israel, I was in the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. And as some of you know who have been to the King David Hotel, there are pictures throughout the hotel of the famous people who have stayed at the King David Hotel. And one of the pictures is of Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger stayed there during the famous Sinai disengagement negotiations. And in the picture of Henry Kissinger walking on a tarmac of an airport is behind him a young staffer carrying a briefcase. That young staffer is Abe Wagner. So from the King David Hotel to Los Angeles to New York, I am delighted now to welcome my good friend, Abraham Wagner.
Thank you, Paul. Is the audio working now?
Yes, you're good.
Yes, it is working. You're fine.
Super. Thank you very much, Paul. I appreciate this kind introduction. I've known Paul for many decades, and thank you for the kind words about the Kissinger book, which would never have happened without Paul twisting my arm over a couple of years to get it done, reading the manuscript and asking me to make some really wonderful changes that I think made it a better book. And for those of you who aren't aware, in his own right, other than his work at Gratz, Paul is a world-class historian who's got a long list of wonderful books and articles he's written. So in any event, I'd like to sort of thank both Paul and the Stern family for the support in the lecture series. Of the Stern family, Marilyn Stern also works on the Middle East, has been a friend for many, many years, and I'm delighted that they're able to support work in this way as well. What I'm going to do, according to the directions I've been given, I'm going to try and talk for about 45 minutes, and then there'll be a time after that for questions and answers, which I've been told that the administrators are going to, get the questions through the question function. They're going to sort out which ones I should answer, and then I will do the best I can. I've prepared some slides to go with this talk, which I think I can do right now. Hopefully this will come up. Gotta go to this thing here. What I'm going to do in this talk is first to provide some historic context of how this machine saying my internet connection's unstable. Maybe the Russians are trying to deplatform me, but in any event, hopefully you can see this and all hear me. What I'd like to do is to provide some historic context about where we've gotten to this point in time with regard to basically Israel and the possibilities of additional peace in the Middle East, and then talk about what some of the current challenges are. And in going through some of this historical material, try and provide a couple of insights from things that I experienced firsthand with Dr. Kissinger, and then sort of later on at various points in time. Bring up the first slide here. I'm not going to go all the way back to the beginning of time, which is sort of compelling now that we've found a basket that goes back about 10,000 years. But one of the points about thinking about, if you think about ancient Palestine just briefly, it's been controlled by a whole series of countries: the Egyptians, the ancient Persians, the Greeks, the Roman Empire, the Crusaders, Muslims. Jews have resided in this area since biblical times continuously, despite the fact they try and claim it's the case. There were no Muslims in biblical Israel. It's a religion that started in the 7th century. But, on the other side, the Ottoman Empire, which was a very, very successful empire, about 7 centuries, ultimately ending in the First World War, covering areas including what are now Egypt, Israel, and Jordan. But the concept of a Jewish homeland basically began with the first Zionist Congress that Theodor Herzl organized in Basel, Switzerland, which basically kicked off the Zionist movement and the Zionist organization. It's worth noting that even at that time, there was no call for Israel. The book published, or the report published, Der Judenstaat, basically talked about a Jewish state, and it was not even clear that it would be in what is now the land of Israel. In fact, there were some interesting thoughts about maybe Der Judenstaat would be at a place in Africa, or even a place near Buffalo, New York, called Grand Island, none of which ever took place. But that was where we kicked off the whole idea of the concept of a Jewish homeland. I like maps, and there's all sorts of nice little maps that are in this presentation. And if you download it, you'll be able to see sort of things. But I mean, the Ottoman Empire basically incorporated a great deal of what is now Israel, as well as other adjacent areas. And it really was, as empires go, a very successful empire that went over many, many centuries. And the Jews lived there in relative peace and security for a long period of time, ultimately ending in the First World War. To go quickly on some of the key points historically, the British defeated the Ottoman Turks as part of the First World War, and that was the end of the Ottoman Empire. The entry of Britain into that area ultimately wound up fairly quickly, actually, after the First World War, in the Balfour Declaration. Which I'm going to show you in a second a little picture of the Balfour Declaration, which established the concept of a homeland for the Jewish people in the broader area of then what was known as Palestine. This was followed fairly quickly by the League of Nations, and the League of Nations came into being after the First World War, and a League of Nations mandate for the area, which basically lasted from 1922 to 1947. Why was there a mandate for Palestine and the other areas? Because Palestine, as the League saw it, was not ready for independence as a nation. There was great difficulties during the mandate period. I'm not going to talk a lot about it. There was hostility between the Arab residents and the Jewish residents. There was, for several years, an Arab revolt in Palestine. The next major document to come along was the Peel Commission report in 1937, again, a British document recommending the partition of what was then Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. You know, again, this is a situation where the Jews accepted the partition formula, the Arabs ultimately rejected it. Another point we're thinking about is, even though this was a mandate period, and there was no Jewish government per se in the area, it was the area of what is known as the Jewish Yishuv, which was a Jewish organization and a pre-state organization, which had a parliament, it had members. It was an early organization, even though it wasn't the official government, it was the pre-state government in the land of Israel, and it established a basic pre-state political and social infrastructure, which ultimately became the government of Israel. I mean, the leader of the Yishuv, David Ben-Gurion, they recruited a school teacher from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Golda Meir, to be the foreign minister, in part because she spoke perfect English. But they was a pre-state organization getting ready for the state of Israel. For those of you who are interested, this is a copy of the draft declaration urged by Rothschild on behalf of the Zionist organization, and the foreign minister of Great Britain, Lord Balfour, where the government, His Majesty's government, accepted the principles that Palestine should be reconstituted as the national home of the Jewish people. So it is an explicit statement then on behalf of the British government that the national home of the Jewish people should in fact be in Palestine, and they would work with the Zionist organization to make that happen. Another cute little map here that came out of the Peel Commission report showing these absolutely absurd borders between what would be the Jewish and Arab areas, which show how strange the alignment or the allocation of the territories might be, even under the Commission report. Another one I'll sort of pass on here. The next major thing to come along was the United Nations Partition Plan. As the British mandate for Palestine was coming to an end, destined to end in 1947, the partition plan provided a plan for independent Jewish and Arab states. It was a fairly short-lived proposition. The Palestinian Arabs, out of hand, rejected it, and they failed to prepare, as the Jewish inhabitants did, for any kind of a government in their allotted territories. There was a brief effort by the Arabs to set up something called an all-Palestine government in Gaza that had no authority over anything. It was repudiated by the Arabs living in Jordan. And it was a period of escalating attacks by Arab inhabitants of the area on Jewish settlements. The only support for the UN partition plan was from the Zionist movement, Ben-Gurion leading the Zionist movement, who accepted the plan, but they very much disliked the assigned territories for the Jewish people. Their paramilitary organization, the Haganah, came up with their own plan called Plan D, which was never implemented either. Let me get this to work here. The UN partition plan, if you look at its quick map, outlines areas for what would be the Jewish state, what would be the Arab state, and an international zone around the area of Jerusalem. Just to be fair here, I've put in a little picture of the Palestinian view of what happened in Palestine. Somewhat strange because you come out in the 1917 era where all of Palestine is a Palestine Arab area, coming down to now where you just have the Gaza Strip and some hodgepodge of territories under the Oslo Accord. I'm going to get back to that at some extent fairly quickly. At the end of the British mandate, May 14th of 48, the state of Israel declared their independence the next day. The plan had been rejected by the Arabs, now calling themselves Palestinians. The new state of Israel was immediately recognized by both the United States and the Soviet Union. A Jewish-Arab civil war had already been underway. The only thing that took place after Israel declared its independence was an escalation of the attacks on the Jewish settlements. The two paramilitary organizations that were Jewish organizations, the Haganah, which was the paramilitary organization of the labor socialist part of the Jewish organization, the Irgun, the paramilitary organization of the right wing, both retaliated against these strikes. And it was not in unanimous support for the state of Israel. The Republic of China, Taiwan, and some other UN members supported the Arabs. Another quick picture, given what's going on these days, to point out both the Haganah and gun fighters were highly egalitarian, probably one of the first armies to actually take in women on an equal footing with the men. They didn't have much money at the time, so the forces, both men and women, were not wearing any official uniforms. And if you look carefully, they're using weapons that were essentially antique junk that had been left over from the Second World War. Another quick view of what the Irgun saw as the land of Israel. This one taken from a recruiting poster in Europe, where the land of Israel, Eretz Yisrael, not includes the land that was designated as Palestine, but sort of everything that's now incorporated in Jordan. Couple of quick points about the War of Independence. Israel was immediately invaded by all the adjacent Arab states. Israel's aims evolved during the war. At the start of the war, they simply wanted to survive an Arab onslaught. They were greatly outnumbered by Arab military forces. What they feared at that point was another Holocaust in the Middle East. They did want to expand the borders of what was the assigned Jewish territory into areas that they thought would be defensible. The important thing to remember here is that the end of the War of Independence was an armistice. It was not a peace. Armistice lines are not international borders. They were simply the lines at which the fighting was stopped. There were actually two armistices. It was only the second one that took. And there are major issues dealing with armistice lines. In terms of migration, 80% of the Palestinians that were in the Jewish areas fled or were driven out. The United Nations established agencies, the Expeditionary Force, the UNAF, to monitor the armistice, much as the armistice in Korea was still being monitored by the United Nations. But the other clear point is that Israel at its outset had no vision of what a peace process with the Arabs would be at all. They simply wanted to survive. Again, if you take a quick look at the 1949 armistice lines, you can see in blue the state of Israel, the other territories, which were Arab territories, Gaza, the West Bank, and Syria. As you know, those of us who lived there at the time, the center of Israel was a very narrow corridor. It was 12 to 14 miles wide. And if you've been in the military, you understand you can fire an artillery shell from the sea into the West Bank. So it was a very indefensible area. talk for just a couple of seconds about some of the additional conflicts, and we're going to talk a bit about a couple of them. The Suez Crisis was a disaster for Britain and France. Didn't change the borders at all. Started out with the Egyptians trying to close the Straits of Tiran back to Israeli shipping. I'm going to talk a good bit about the Six-Day War, the 70 War of Attrition effort by the part of the Egyptians over a couple of years to inflict some casualties on Israel. I think the only thing here to note is that there was ultimately a ceasefire negotiated by Secretary Rogers, possibly the only useful thing Rogers ever did in his entire life before Nixon fired him. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the Yom Kippur War, which is highly critical. The Six-Day War is enormously important. It began with preemptive attacks on Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. The Egyptians had closed the Straits of Tiran, which they'd agreed to leave open after '56. They kicked the United Nations out, and it was clear from intelligence sources that there was going to be an attack by the Arab states on Israel. Israel got ahead of the impending attacks. Strangely enough, the Arab states were routed in less than a week, and the Six-Day War were actually 3 two-day wars, 2 with Egypt in the Sinai, 2 with Syria and Golan, and 2 with Jordan and the West Bank. The major changes were enormous. They were changes in the 49 armistice lines. The West Bank was captured up to the Jordan River. The Golan Heights were taken from Syria. The Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza were captured from Egypt, and all of Jerusalem was now in Israeli hands. 300,000 Palestinians fled the West Bank, and 100,000 Syrians left the Golan. A few points worth thinking about, other than the fact that it was a major victory, is Israel had absolutely no concept of how to deal with success. They hadn't planned on this happening, and there was major debate within the Israeli leadership about what to do. Even during the war, Moshe Dayan, who was leading the Israeli forces, constantly changed his mind. Sometimes he consulted with the prime minister and the cabinet. Sometimes he didn't. They couldn't decide whether they would go to the Jordan River or not. They couldn't decide whether they were going to take Jerusalem or not. Ultimately, they got to the Jordan River. They captured Jerusalem, and they wound up with more territory than they had ever imagined at the outset. And the major problem here, and sometimes I tend, even though I'm a strong supporter of Israel, Israel functionally failed to control the narrative after the war. They never came up with a concept of what the West Bank would be. They allowed the narrative of the occupied West Bank to come into existence with no pushback. They really didn't understand what they would do in terms of the administration, for example, of the West Bank. And they allowed a perception to grow that this was somehow not Israel, despite the fact that large parts of the Israeli population were unhappy with that. And if you look at other areas of the world where a war has been won and territory has been acquired, we won a revolution against Great Britain. We're not talking about New Jersey being the West Bank of Great Britain. We're not talking about the state of Texas being the North Bank of Mexico. Yet they allowed this narrative to evolve, which has gotten them into an enormous amount of trouble over the subsequent years. And we'll get back to that in a bit. Now, to take a quick look here at the territories captured in the 67, they were enormous. You know, they took over the entire Sinai and Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and you can see up in the north a large amount of the Golan Heights. Moving quickly again to the Yom Kippur War. It was a surprise attack on Israel by Syria and Egypt, attempting to regain the territories they'd lost in '67. The war took place mostly in the Sinai and Golan Heights. Jordan didn't get involved. Talk about the initial Arab success. There's been a great deal written about the intelligence failures of Israel, even though they had high-grade intelligence that the attack was going to take place. They lost a considerable number of lives, both in the Sinai and the Golan Heights. Israel was able to repel the initial Egyptian and Syrian successes. There was a huge counteroffensive. And you wound up with a situation of the Egyptian Third Army being cut off and trapped in the Sinai and Damascus under siege. It's worth noting here that for the first time in all of the wars, Damascus, Syria, the capital, well, actually Aleppo, but Damascus, the largest city in Syria, was being bombed by Israel. Nothing that ever happened before. All of the wars with Syria had taken place in the Golan, which for those people living in Damascus could have been on the moon. Major impact on the Syrians. Talk for a second about Kissinger's efforts to end the war. As a young staffer working for him at the time, Kissinger at the time, even though he was Jewish, was getting enormous grief in the press for not supporting Israel to the extent that many thought he would have. Kissinger's objective here, well, he knew that Israel would ultimately win, but he was trying to avoid a situation where the Arabs were absolutely vanquished and there would be an inability to make peace. So working with the Soviets and Gromyko, who Dobrynin at the time, were on very good terms with Kissinger, even though the Cold War was on, managed to negotiate, for example, a ceasefire and disengagement talks. On the Egyptian side, the famed Kilometer 101 talks with Egypt just after the cessation of hostilities went surprisingly well. We were shocked. The Egyptian and Israeli generals in this tent at 101 got ahead of Kissinger, and he actually got angry that they were getting further in terms of a peace agreement than Kissinger thought he wanted to take credit for. Later on, you will find that the Egyptian officers who had gone to schools, graduate schools in Egypt, or I'm sorry, in the United Kingdom and in the United States, spoke perfect English, got along surprisingly well with their Israeli counterparts, and actually worked out things very, very rapidly on a phased disengagement in the Sinai. The disengagement talks with the Syrians took far longer and were actually assisted by the Egyptians. At the point in time, Kissinger undertook this sort of shuttle diplomacy, which were a couple of dozen airline trips between Israel and Damascus, arguing about a small area in an abandoned Syrian town of Quneitra. Kissinger at the time was complaining about a couple of things. One, he kept saying, I'm the Secretary of State of the United States, I'm not a rug merchant. And the second thing he was complaining about was the failure of the people to get him his laundry on time. But the result of this sort of lengthy negotiation was a disengagement agreement with Syria that had endured for over 40 years. You know, after this agreement, even though there was no peace negotiated with Syria, there was not one rocket that ever came down from the Golan Heights into the agricultural Hula Valley in Israel below. And the result of these Kissinger's efforts paved the way for peace agreements, ultimately with Egypt and Jordan. Okay, talk for a second about some peace agreements that worked. The Camp David Accords. We replaced bilateral peace with a multilateral approach. There was a plan based on a Geneva Peace Conference, the thought of Arab recognition of Israel's right to exist, possibly Israeli withdrawal from territories occupied in 1967 and securing an undivided Jerusalem. One of the great surprises was Egyptian President Anwar Sadat having this enormous epiphany that surprised both the United States and Israel when he made a historic trip to Jerusalem and declared it really was time for peace, which led to an Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, diplomatic relations, and I would also add here military relations that have endured to this day. If we fast forward ahead to the present day, the level of cooperation, for example, between the Egyptian military services, and here I would also add the Egyptian intelligence services and their Israeli counterparts on a day-to-day basis, dealing with things like ISIS and terrorism, control of tunnels going into Gaza, has been enormous. And this friendship that began at Kilometer 101 has evolved over decades between Israeli officers, Egyptian officers. They know each other's names. They have each other's cell phone numbers. If something comes up, they call each other and talk and work things out, and they mutually support each other. The other key point here is it was a disintegration of the United Arab Front against Israel. Egypt made a deal, the others did not. In passing, there was a Lebanon-Israel agreement in 1983. It was never implemented, basically because there was a civil war and the government of Lebanon that agreed, it was gone. The third one here is the Jordanian-Israel peace agreement, 1994, again, diplomatic and security relations. Why it took that long to conclude an agreement with Jordan, it's very difficult to say. At this point in time, there's been good relations for many years. Dust up a couple of days ago over flights and Jordanian delegation visiting the mosque. But at this point in time, if it was not for the Israeli security services, the government of Jordan would probably not exist. Couple of comments about checking the time. I don't want to get too far. Okay, I'm doing fine. A couple of examples of failed efforts of the 1990s. The Madrid conference in 91 was the concept of Secretary James Baker. The idea is that Israel should abandon what he called expansionist policies. It was the first time that all parties actually met in a face-to-face venue, but nothing was accomplished. There were some bilateral negotiations which continued that ultimately paved the way for Oslo, some of them highly secret. The Israelis did talk to Palestinians, the Jordanians, which all became a treaty, and the Syrians. I put Oslo here in the category of a failed effort. It began with some secret PLO-Israeli talks. The Accords, which were actually never signed by the other side, based on the Camp David idea and security resolutions 242 and 338, with the stated goals of having a Palestinian interim self-government and within 5 years trying to come up with a permanent settlement of the unresolved issue. Key problem here, and the reason I call it a failure, I'll put up a map in a moment, is the whole idea of this withdrawal of Israeli forces from Palestinian territories and transfer to the Palestinian authorities never quite took place as envisioned. I have a couple of maps of the Oslo Accord. The whole point here being that if you look at the designated territories that would be Israeli territories, Palestinian territories, what you see here is a patchwork quilt. No security person can look at this patchwork of, territories here and there. And here's the one with the areas designated A, B, and C under Oslo. There's no way to construct a Palestinian state and draw lines or borders with this collage of territories. I mean, look at countries that are not contiguous. Pakistan. There are two chunks of Pakistan. I mean, even in the United States, we've got one state, Michigan's in two places behind, okay. There's no way to construct a contiguous Palestinian state within this area and then link it to the Gaza Strip, even though they talked a bit about, building a tunnels for example. So there is a geographic problem, even if you're willing to buy into the concept of a Palestinian state in the West Bank. Where is it and where do you draw it? Nobody has the slightest idea. Talk for a couple seconds here about what I call the myth of the two-state solution. This is a term that has been the central focus of the peace process for decades. It's been embraced by the United States, the Soviet Union, now Russia, and many in Israel. The simple idea of a state of Palestine alongside the state of Israel. You immediately get into an argument about the boundary of Israel, and people keep referring to the pre-1967 borders. As I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, the pre-1967 seven borders are the 1949 armistice lines. And if you look really carefully at what these pre-67 borders are, you wound up losing things like the road between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv is suddenly no longer part of Israel. And you can go on from there. So going back to the 1949 armistice lines is a non-starter. The other thing is that this concept, which sounds sort of good at a sort of macro level, it ignores several key realities. The Arabs, Palestinians have fought several wars with Israel. They've lost all of them. What does losing entitle you to under international law? Nothing. The Palestinians still deny Israel's right to exist. And if you read their literature, particularly in Arabic, they're still in calling for the destruction of Israel and death to the Jews. I mean, can you imagine if this was symmetric and Israel had proclamations? The Palestinians should be pushed into the sea and killed? I mean, it'd be outroar internationally. And as I say, the idea of the pre-67 borders is absolute nonsense. The 49 armistice lines are not defensible. And most importantly, many in Israel see Judea and Samaria, which is also referred to as the West Bank, as part of Israel. If you look, and I'm going to do that in a couple of minutes, as to what is Israel now politically, recent poll a day or so ago, because there's a new election, the fourth one in 2 years coming up, 80% of the Israeli electorate support right-wing parties. The right-wing parties in Israel look at those lands as Judea and Samaria, and a major component of the Israeli electorate are the Orthodox Jewish parties. They see it as a biblical mandate. They go back to the Parsha Lech Lecha. The Lord God gave Judea and Samaria to the Jewish people. Who are you to tell them that it should be given to someone else? On the other side of the equation, the Sinai was returned to Egypt under an agreement, and Gaza has already been given to the Palestinians. Arik Sharon did it in exchange for absolutely nothing. He did it for security reasons, not religious reasons. He pulled 30,000 Israeli troops out of Gaza that were defending a couple of settlers in the south of the Gaza Strip, and there was no religious argument at all. It was simply a security and economic decision. So one of the things we're talking about in terms of how would you negotiate an agreement or a peace with the Palestinians, not going to spend a lot of time talking about the intifadas that took place. The key point here is that there is no unified Palestinian leadership. They can't agree on anything. You've got the Palestinian Authority, the successor to the PLO, in charge in the West Bank. And if you read the papers today from Israel, Abbas, who's turned 85, not in good health, is in very difficult political circumstances. They're about to have an election there, the first serious election since 2005. And the Palestinians, according to the papers today, are asking him to resign or go away. Even if he controls the PA in the future, they control nothing else. You have the Hamas in Gaza, which have tried a number of times to reconcile themselves with the PA with no success at all, and are essentially an Iranian puppet. And the third component is the Hezbollah in Lebanon. So if you're talking about the Palestinians per se agreeing with Israel, who's going to agree? Abbas can't agree and bring the others along. So there's a major open question here. Another key ingredient that gets a great deal of attention now is that the world has greatly changed. And if you're talking about the broader Mideast region, you're talking about a couple of components that really have nothing to do with Israel. You're talking about the rise of radical Islam and the Iranian threat. If you looked at the Middle East a couple of decades ago and asked, well, who is the largest of the powers in the region, leaving Israel aside? It was Egypt. If you ask that same question today, the most serious, largest power in the Middle East region is Iran. The threat is far greater to the region than anything related to the Arab-Israeli conflict. You've had, in the terror side, you've had Al-Qaeda emerging as a major transnational threat, seeking the removal of all foreign influences from Muslim countries, an ongoing threat to Saudi Arabia and the other Arab states. You've had ISIS emerging as a major transnational threat, another mismanaged result of the Iraq after 9/11. And you've got a situation now where Iran is threatening regional states and supporting terrorism. It's a much more serious concern to the Arab states than Israel at all. And you've got a situation now where the Arab states need Israel as a deterrent to Iran, which is a much different situation than existed a couple of years ago. I'm going to pass by some of these lovely charts you can see before. One of my favorites is this lovely view of ISIS, who insist on drowning people by lowering them into the sea on a steel cage. Our friend Abbas, leading the Palestinian Authority, if you remember him by his earlier name, Abu Mazen, was the architect of the assassination of the Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics. What have you got going on now? Radicalization in social media, something we never had before. It's a much different world in terms of security. Let's talk for a couple of minutes, and we're doing well on the time here, about, okay, a new approach to peace. What is going on now and what makes the difference? There was a change in the process in the United States during the Trump administration. The National Security Council and White House basically took a hold of what was going on. It's the same approach that worked for the Nixon administration, and there's sort of some similar thinking. The Trump administration was trying to avoid some of the failed policies of the past, and what they saw is the old hands and Arabists at the State Department. Going back to the Nixon administration, one of the things that you might think about is in the first meeting between Richard Nixon, who had won the election before the inauguration, and Henry Kissinger in New York, where they sat for a couple of hours thinking about how they would structure national security after the administration came in. They agreed on a couple of things, and one of the things they agreed upon was that the conduct of foreign policy and the initiatives would have to come out of the National Security Council, not the Department of State. And it needed to be built on some level of trust with Israel and the Arab states. Interesting thought, the meeting with Nixon, even though they had a 2-hour discussion, Nixon forgot to offer him the job as National Security Advisor. And somebody later told him, did he accept? And Nixon said, oh, I forgot to tell him that. They fixed that. Shortly after that, the Nixon administration started business, and Henry initially, started work developing an approach to not only the Middle East, but to China. So what took place in the process in the Trump White House is that even though you didn't have a Kissinger, you wound up having NSC staffers, as well as Jared Kushner wasn't on any of the staff, but is working as a senior advisor to the president, working with the U.S. Ambassador Friedman in Tel Aviv. And somebody once asked Ambassador Friedman, who as an ambassador was a State Department person, well, who is his boss? And he said, well, Jared Kushner. But you had a different approach. What's taking place now, you have a transition to the Biden administration. You have gotten, and when I was writing a little while ago, it was not clear how things would sort out in terms of would the NSC under Jake Sullivan, who's a brilliant young fellow, and some good people that have really come in, would he be the lead person on working with the Mideast and some other foreign policy initiatives? Or would it be Tony Blinken, another brilliant person who's now taken over Secretary of State? It's early on in the game. It appears that Blinken has taken an enormously strong initiative in dealing with things like Iran. Both Sullivan and Blinken were meeting with their Chinese counterparts recently. So that's in the early days of sorting things out. But even though I've worked for some prior administrations starting out with Nixon, you really have some good people that have come in both at state and the National Security Council with extensive experience, and they're sorting out how they will deal with these sort of things. And I have hope that this will evolve as days go on. Say a couple of words here about the Abraham Accords of 2020. It was touted by the Trump administration as the first major peace agreements in many decades. Yeah, they were peace agreements. They were with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. Yeah, these are good. But these are little Arab states that were never at war with Israel and didn't even exist at the time of Israeli independence. There was no UAE person or Bahraini that ever died in war with Israel. No Israeli ever died at the hands of the military forces of these places. On the other side, these are Arab states with substantial resources, even though they're small, and there are common interests in commerce, common interests in technology. The big point about the Abraham Accords is that the Palestinians were sold down the drain. For years, this whole idea of the solution of the Palestinian problem being the sine qua non against any further agreement with Israel, you have to solve the Palestinian problem first. The Accords sort of pushed this off to the side. The Palestinians were outraged. I have to talk for a quick second about COVID and the unintended consequences of the Abraham Accords. Nobody believed in negotiating an agreement with Dubai that the new face of peace would be wealthy Israelis going to Dubai to hold their weddings, to celebrate and party. So that apart from the diplomatic and commerce, the new face of peace seems to be Dubai is the new party spot for some Israelis. Okay, so sort of where are we going to go from? Where do we go from here? I've got a couple of minutes left. Okay. The big question at the time of the Abraham Accords is, does Saudi Arabia, largest of the Arab states who didn't sign on, get added to the group? It's a subject of discussion. I doubt seriously that there's going to be any formal accord until the king dies. Saudi Arabia is, a corrupt 12th century feudal monarchy. The king is old, not in possession of all of his faculties. The country is run by his crooked son, who's, suddenly been shown up for, calling for murders. And Iran continues to be the major threat, and they need Israel. So that's going to sort of continue on, and I don't see much of anything happening in terms of a formal relationship for a bit of time. My favorite area of interest right now is a peace agreement with Syria. Maybe this is possible in the aftermath of the Syrian civil war, which is about at an end. It's over a decade now, and it's sort of winding down. Most people don't realize that an accord with the Syrians was very, very close before the civil war broke out. The reason that and it was down to basically 100 yards in the Golan. It was ridiculous when it was being discussed what to do with this last couple of 100 yards. I talked to Kissinger about it to seek his advice. And he said, tell him you'll lease it for 100 years. Never quite happened. And the failure to conclude that agreement, I do not lay at the feet of the Syrians. I lay at the feet of Tzipi Livni in Israel and Condi Rice in Washington. Why? Condi Rice didn't like it because it wasn't her deal. And when I spoke to Tzipi Livni about it at a lunch, he said, well, I'm too busy to deal with that now. And I said, you're really not. It didn't go very well. But I believe there's hope there. And if you sort of look at what goes on, practically on the ground, the Golan is very, very different from what you see in Gaza. The Golan, if those of you who've been there, is a rich agricultural area. The Arabs living on both sides of the heights are Druze, Druzim. They're not Sunni Shiite crazies. It's a wealthy, good-to-do agricultural area. And even now, strange things have been going on. Syrians living in the Golan after the war broke out were going to universities in Israel. Israel was taking care of war casualties in the Golan. Syria desperately needs help with post-war reconstruction. And the 74 Israeli-Syrian disengagement agreement worked for over 40 years. Both sides want it back again. And does that get converted into an actual peace? Hopefully downstream that might happen. The last piece of the equation here, or at least this slide, what about Lebanon? Well, Lebanon, despite the fact there was a significant military conflict in 2006, which was absolute disaster for Israel. They wasted large amounts of weaponry and got absolutely nowhere. There are no border issues. There have never been border issues between Israel and Lebanon. The border is what it is. And there have been talks with the Hezbollah fairly recently over some naval issues that apparently went fairly well. The major problem with Lebanon is not a geographic issue. It's the massive number of very good Iranian missiles which are being stored there and do pose a serious military threat to Israel. I think the last slide here to talk for a couple of seconds is this remaining Palestinian government, Palestinian problem. What you need to realize, Israel is still governed by a right-wing coalition. The Labor Party, which governed Israel for a lot of its existence, is now down to 6 of 120 seats in the Knesset. It's close to nothing. Likud-led coalition has been the government of Israel since 1977. As I was saying before, in Israel, the religious parties do count. They see Judea and Samaria as part of Israel. And this debate over Jewish settlements in occupied territories goes on. I could sort of say in passing, if you want to talk about Gaza, which, I don't see Gaza a major military problem. And the weapons in Gaza, the rockets, which cause a bit of problem every now and then, these balloons are not major military systems. And if you look at some of the thought in Israel, where there's a very large Russian population, their view of the situation is that they should turn it into a parking lot. But in any event, at this point in time, there is no serious Israeli support for the two-state solution. It was dismissed by Prime Minister Netanyahu in 2015. And even on the left-wing side, Avram Berg, a major thinker there, says it's impossible. Abbas is seen as a joke and in charge of nothing. Gaza continues to be ruled by Hamas, supported by Iran, not the PA. They continue to fire some rockets into Israel and call for Israel's destruction. The only thing useful lately is the United States has stopped funding schools which publish textbooks calling for the death of all the Jews. And there is no Israeli concept of what actual defensible borders of a Palestinian state would actually be. And, okay, I've now gone 2 minutes over, and I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm absolutely delighted to take any questions that might be there. Who's in charge, Naomi?
Okay, I'm gonna check out some of the questions that have come through. I guess the question here, the first question is about, well, essentially, if the two-state solution is not a viable solution, what is this? What is a viable solution?
That's a really, really good question. There is not a lot that has been written by any of the authorities as to exactly what would go on. Nobody has proposed an alternative, and taking the other side of it, the idea of incorporating all of the West Bank into Israel and making all of the residents of the West Bank territory Israeli citizens is an electoral disaster. Israel winds up becoming an Arab nation, and they have no answer for that. By and large, most of the people in Israel are simply willing to ignore the problem. I mean, when polls a day or two ago, 20.5% of the Israeli electorate even think it's an issue. They would prefer to simply ignore it and let things coast as they are. Are you going to look for sort of band-aids like, this continual argument over an Israeli settlement here and there, dealing with, small issues? So there has been nothing proposed as a significant alternative that the Israeli would ever go through the Israeli Knesset and be supported by the international. We simply don't know.
Follow up to that was, what are your thoughts on a proposal made by Peter Beinart for a two-state alternative to a two-state solution? Is that a proposal you're familiar with?
Not offhand. I'm maybe not reading all the right newspapers, but if you want to see, what those components would be, I'm happy to respond to them.
Okay. Let me move on to another question. This one is about Jordan. Given the demographic realities in Jordan, how serious do you think the threat is of a collapsed Hashemite kingdom in the next 15 years? And what are the security/peace implications for Israel?
Very, very good question. Jordan has a Hashemite king. The Hashemites are less than 30% of the population of Jordan. If you remember Bloody September, they fought a war against the Palestinians. And as I sort of mentioned earlier, King Abdullah is possibly one of the most reasonable and insightful leaders in the Middle East. He is supported very strongly by the Israeli security services. I think without the support of the Israeli security services, his government would be seriously threatened. What's going to take place over the next 15 years? I believe they will continue to have the strong support of Israel in any security situation that comes up. Israel has an enormous vested interest in maintaining Jordan as its friend and neighbor. When you saw, for example, 2 revolutions in a short period of time in Egypt, the Israelis were enormously disturbed about the Muslim Brotherhood being the government there. They have strongly supported the al-Sisi government and see that as a key to, sort of the 2 pillars on the east and the west of the state of Israel are Jordan and Egypt. And there's an enormous incentive for the Israelis to, maintain that, even getting beyond some of the little, dust up the last couple of days, which I think is borders on silly, but, we'll move beyond that.
Okay. You mentioned that there are no territorial disputes between Israel and Syria, but wasn't the
not with Lebanon?
With Lebanon. Okay. The rest of the question is, wasn't the Sheba Farms Triangle an area of contention between the 2 nations?
It was a minuscule piece of land. There's no residual. It's not like the Golan Heights of the West Bank. Okay. You're talking about a minuscule piece of land, and to sort of quote Kissinger again, you're talking about a couple of yards here and there, all of which are fairly negotiable. And I think one of the useful things is if you look at the people who populate that area, I've got relatives living on a kibbutz Kfar Blum, which is very, very close to that border. And I've spent a good amount of time up there. One of the key things going on between the Israelis on the one side of the line and the Lebanese on the other side of the line is smuggling. Mm-hmm. That is an economic interest, but they have no great differences in terms of land or politics or anything else. One of the things you need to recognize about the Hezbollah is they are in fact the government of Lebanon. For a long time, they were not only a military force, but south of the Litani River, they were the entire economic and social and religious infrastructure of the area. There's a very good RAND Corporation study published a couple of years ago about Hezbollah. And even though he's been the recipient of a large amount of Iranian largesse, Nasrallah is not crazy. he really would like to sort of run a reasonable government. And I don't think he really wants to get in any kind of a shooting war with the Israelis.
So I'm going to sort of ask two questions. One, before we wrap, one is several questions came in regarding the situation with Iran, and then another set of questions. I see sort of a grouping of questions that have to do with the United States and what's happening here in our relation to Israel. So let me start with the Iranian issue. One question related to this is, do you see a consortium of Arab states with Israel dealing with the Iranian problem anytime soon, if at all? And the other related question is, what is the likelihood of an open military confrontation between Israel and Iran or its proxies?
Well, okay, two very good points. Okay, depends on what you mean by a coalition. A military coalition, a political coalition. The only, significant military forces in the area in terms of capability are Egypt, which really doesn't have an issue with Iran. The Syrians, who accepted Iranian support in the civil war and now would like them to leave. You have Saudi Arabia, which has, 24% of all the sales of US military equipment go to Saudi Arabia. They have a military that couldn't fight its way out of a paper bag. They're absolutely useless. I mean, the only serious military force in terms of operational capability are the Israelis. I mean, they'd be dependent on that, which is a sort of bizarre thing, which is why they're looking to Israel. I mean, yeah, you're going to sell the UAE, some F-35s. What are they going to do with them? Nothing. And they're not a real military power. The second part of it was, I'm sorry, say again the second part of the question.
Do you
a war between Israel and
right? And related to that, do you think Israel would ever do a preemptive attack on Israel? Would that be a possibility? On Iran, rather.
The Israelis? No. The major issue with the Israelis is the nuclear program. Okay. Both the Israeli Defense Forces and the Israeli intelligence services for years now have been telling the prime minister, this is a truly bad idea. And it is a truly bad idea. For us, as well as the Israelis, if you're talking about those facilities, they're deeply buried, they're underground. We don't even know where all of them are. You're not going to go flying from Israel to Iran and knock those facilities out. I mean, to share a quick bit of insight, contractor I work with in the United States was trained in the old Soviet Union. And, he was in charge of pouring concrete at Chernobyl. But, he went for, reunion of his colleagues. And he said, the guys that were designing these facilities in Iran went to the same technical institute I attended in Moscow. We were only taught to build things one way, to survive a nuclear blast. Okay, one of the slides I use in my class is a picture of the cap on the Qum facility. You're talking about 100 meters of reinforced concrete. You're not going to blow that cap off with anything other than a nuclear weapon. And the Israelis are not going to launch a nuclear war against Iran. So the idea of launching some sort of a war against Iran, apart from the fact it's not even an adjacent state to Israel, I think is relatively out of the question. And, like I was saying, even the Israeli military dismissed the, concept of a strike against these facilities. And as I say, you've got to, look seriously as a military person as to how these facilities were constructed and what an attack, really might take. It's a very, very difficult problem. Not simple.
Not simple. So let me pivot to questions about the United States-Israel kind of relationship. And so this question has to deal with the more far left, a growing element of far left sentiment in the United States. How does Israel see that? How does Israel deal with that? And how can Jews in the United States help protect Israel and work with the left?
It's a very important thing to see. I mean, what's been going on over a period of years is not just the far left, but the left in the United States has come to see Israel, which has been, ruled by a right-wing coalition for many, many years. They don't like Bibi Netanyahu, and they have, in large part, adopted a pro-Palestinian or BDS way of looking at the world. I mean, a lot of them, tend to see the Palestinians as poor oppressed people. Are they an analog for minorities that were oppressed in the United States? Mm-hmm. And it has been apart from the Orthodox Jewish community in the United States, which strongly supports Israel and a right-wing government, it has been an increasing problem. And I think this is another area where Israel has absolutely failed to control the narrative effectively or respond to that. There has been some pushback in the United States against the BDS movement. The fact that you have the documents for the BLM movement in the United States, which are embraced by the far left or even the left, as being viciously anti-Semitic. It is a growing problem. There's growing, amounts of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic curricula, many universities. It's a growing problem, and there is no effective pushback that I can see. The Scholars for Peace in the Middle East try a bit. The anti-BDS movement tries a bit. AIPAC tries a bit. I'm not their favorite guy, I got to tell you, but in any event. And I think Israel here has not done well in trying to sort of meet this challenge. It's a major problem as we go ahead, and I don't know the answer to this.
What do you think is the greatest misunderstanding Americans in general have about Israel?
I think by and large, Americans don't understand the nature of the security situation and the difficulties that Israel has in terms of policy. They don't understand the nature of the Israeli government. They don't understand how the coalition process works there, and they don't understand the constraints that putting a right-wing coalition government together has. I mean, this is a radically different Israel than it was in the days of David Ben-Gurion, Moshe Dayan, Golda Meir, the people of the past. And if you look at the constraints that Netanyahu faces now, even though 80% of the electorate wants a right-wing government, he's got huge problems in forming a coalition. My doctoral work,
yep.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, how long do you think, there's a question about how long you believe Netanyahu will be able to remain in power?
Well, I mean, that's a very, very good question. Yeah, every day, my favorite paper, I subscribe to Haaretz, which is a very, very left-wing Israeli paper, but has the best writers in Israel, okay? There's this one thought that he's like Vladimir Putin, he's going to be sort of, prime minister forever. But at this point in time, the major right-wing parties likely to form a coalition don't want him as the prime minister. So does he get taken out by the coalition negotiation, or does he get taken out by going to jail? Not clear whether that's going to be. Right now, there's a huge amount of uncertainty. It'll clear up in the next couple of months. But yes, he will lead the Likud list, but the Likud list is only coming in with 28 seats out of 120. There's never been a majority government in the history of Israel. They've all been coalitions. And if you look at the next two largest parties, they're brand new parties. They're very right-wing, and they don't like Netanyahu. Mm-hmm. Now, if they manage to come up with a right-wing bloc for which he is not standing as prime minister, that may be a problem. But it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. He's got an enormous ego. Sort of the Donald Trump of Israel, who knows? He's got a huge ego, and he's got the support of his party. But they've got to make a deal to get the mandate. And there is some question as to whether the president, who gives a particular person a mandate for a few weeks to try and form a coalition, whether it will be him or Gantz or Lapid. I don't know. Good question. We'll see.
Yeah, lots of good questions coming through. So I'm going to ask Paul, our president, Paul Finkelman, if he, before we wrap, if he has any other questions he would like to ask. Paul, do you want to join?
I'm trying to put my picture up, and my host won't let me. Now they will.
Oh, there you go.
So now I am back. So I have two questions that came out of your talk. One is that since 1945, with the exception of a few pot shots that the Pakistanis and the Indians shoot at each other over Kashmir, and then they stop and forget about it, no nuclear power has ever fought a war with another nuclear power. The Soviet Union and the US had proxy wars in Korea and Vietnam, but we never went to war with the Soviet Union. They never went to war with us. So if Iran gets the bomb, does it matter for Israel? In fact, is it plausible to think that if Iran actually has the bomb, that there will be more likelihood of peace because neither side dares go to war with the other because the outcome would be a nuclear holocaust? That's question one, and I'll give you question two if Naomi will let me ask two questions.
Oh, you want me to answer that one first?
Yeah.
Okay, that's an incredibly good question. And despite the fact that I've been writing op-eds and papers for years about how tragic it would be if Iran got the bomb, I'm probably going to write one going the other way. So what would really happen? Okay, what does it mean to have a bomb? Okay, it takes, if you're talking about a uranium bomb, you're talking about 90 pounds of reprocessed U-235 to make one bomb. Okay, and they haven't got that yet. Okay, before you get a bomb, you have to set up something called a device, a test model. Okay, may or may not work, may work. Okay, if they were to build a nuclear stockpile, a bunch of bombs, that would take a very, very long time. Okay, then they would have to have a ballistic missile capability, assuming you're not going to replace it, to get them to Israel. That would take a very, very long time. If they were to try and launch something toward Israel, the Israelis have got an absolutely wonderful, missile defense system. The likelihood of it being shot down is very high. I'm not supposed to talk about this subject because of my prior work, but assuming what's written in the papers is sort of correct about an Israeli nuclear force, with anywhere between 90 and 200 weapons, with land-based missiles, sea-based missiles, and aircraft. They have a triad. Their ability to turn Iran into a smoldering parking lot is very high. That's an enormously powerful deterrent. So the question is, Iran is never going to come up with any kind of a significant tested stockpile, even without the agreement. The ability to try and attack Israel, it'd be insanity because Israel could sort of vaporize the country. So, it may not be all that bad. This year I'll write something sort of on that subject, and you'll get a chance to review it. If years ago they had, during the Iran-Iraq War, and one of these books that you looked at is that book Tony and I did on the Iran-Iraq War. If they had had a nuclear weapon at the time of the Iran-Iraq War, they would have tried to blow Iraq up immediately. Those days are long gone. So, it's a very, very good question as to what a nuclear-armed Iran would actually look like, and would they, make any attempt to do anything to try and go after Israel when the likely response would be the certain death of most of the Iranian population? Good question. I don't think so. They're not, they're a little weird, but they're not that crazy.
So why is the focus so heavily on not having a nuclear deal with Iran from so many supporters of Israel?
Well, without spending the next 45 minutes discussing the pluses and minuses of the JCPOA, all the experts agree that it was a bad deal. Most of the experts agree that it should have been signed because it was the best deal that was possible at the time, and it was better to have that deal than no deal at all. The inspection regime was faulty. They cheated like crazy on some stuff. It did not incorporate ballistic missiles. It did not incorporate the Iranian support to terrorist organizations. I believe that, it will be, and you can't go back to what happened before. And I think Blinken, who's been sort of outspoken on this, and some of the others get it. And I'm not sure where that negotiation is ultimately going to go. We shall see. I've written that, if there's going to be a new agreement of any kind, and there was a lot of pressure at the end of the Obama administration, the principal negotiator, Wendy Sherman, Kerry sort of, wandered in and out occasionally with his expensive bicycle and his guitar. But there was an enormous pressure to, come up with an agreement in a sort of compressed time frame. You've got a lot more time and, time ahead. And if there's a new agreement, I think that there's reasonable belief that my thinking and others, that if there's going to be a new agreement, it would be one, that makes sense in terms of the development of the isotopes, as well as the missiles, and as well as, support to terrorist organizations. We'll see. I think he's got some good people lined up to work on it.
Naomi, if I could ask one more question. You a couple of times talked about how Israel did not control the narrative, both in the US and in the world in a variety of ways. And
correct.
And you also talked briefly about the problem of US politics being influenced by Israel and vice versa. My question is, does the majority of the political leadership in Israel really care what happens to American Jews? That is, do they look at us and say, well, if things get bad enough, they'll come here and we'll have more people in our country, which will be good for Israel. And if they don't come here, we don't really care because we don't need them anymore. Our economy is incredibly strong without them. We're going to get aid from the US because we're the only stable democracy and the only stable, rational country in the area. And the rest of the world depends on a stable Israel. And so who cares about the American Jews?
You got about 4 questions packed into one there. Okay. I think by and large, the Israeli leadership does care about what American Jewry thinks, whether it's in terms of selling Israel bonds or moral support. They do care what people think, and they are disturbed about what they see is going on among the Jewish population in the United States. And as I said earlier, they have been really bad about trying to do anything about it. They're going to get the $3.5 billion a year from the United States come hell or high water, because nobody in Congress is going to really vote to shut that money off. Do they really need it? I don't think so, but that's sort of going to go on forever. But they do care, and I think, like as I said, they don't quite know what to do about it. I mean, they see what's going on here. I think they, by and large, in terms of the immigration, that's not a big issue these days. It was an enormous issue at the time that we were trying to get Jews out of the Soviet Union. And one of the things that, as we point out in the book, that, Kissinger managed to negotiate in exchange for dealing with the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. And suddenly all these Jews start flooding out of the Soviet Union, and Israel tells them privately, shut the flow down, we're being flooded. But it's not like that anymore. The pace of Jewish immigration into Israel is fairly, regulated. Now there's not a huge number coming in. They can certainly deal with it. But they do care. But I think by and large, they often bungle the way they deal with it. I don't know how you fix that.
Thank you. And thank you for flying all the way from Los Angeles to come to Graz today. We greatly appreciate it.
It was a wonderful trip. I was very careful in the airport. I wore my mask all the way.
Good.
And I want to thank you, people at Graz, Naomi, and the Stern family for making this all possible. It's been a delight to be with you. And if anybody else has more questions, they can send me a note or call and yell or complain to Twitter and get me kicked off or something.
And when the world opens up again, I hope we'll have you back and we can all go out to dinner and talk more and do something.
My pleasure.
As well as
only if you invite Naomi.
Yeah, of course. And the Stearns.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you, Abe.
Thanks everybody.
Azizan Pesach. If you can know any Hebrew.
Azizan Pesach. Yes.
Azizan Pesach. Okay. Bye. Thanks, guys.
Okay. I just want to say a quick thank you to all of you who've joined us tonight. Go to our website, check out our newsletter to learn about upcoming events. We have a great event on April 18th featuring Nashira, which is the Jewish Chorale of Philadelphia. It's going to be excellent. We have Wayne Dawkins from Morgan State talking on May 4th about U.S. Representative Emmanuel Seller based on a biography he wrote. And lots of great stuff happening at Gratz. So please stay plugged in. And again, thank you all for joining us. Dr. Wagner, thank you for answering all of Paul's questions and staying late. And thank you all. Have a great night.
Thank you all.
Be well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Stay safe, everyone.